can be with us each week. We have made it to the end of the book of Acts. This is a lot of Acts. Are you tired? Because Paul has traveled over 10,000 miles. It's hard to believe that. But in his missionary journey, after he was called by Jesus to do what he was told to do, he would travel over 10,000 miles. Not on a car, not in an airplane. Most of it was walking. And, just we mentioned a few minutes ago about the week of Thanksgiving. And I found myself this week being thankful for a lot of things. We'll think on that all the way through Thanksgiving week here and Thanksgiving Day. But I found myself while we were getting ready for a lesson here of being thankful for Paul. And, the entire New Testament, once Paul pops on the scene, has such a theme of persistence and determination and not quitting. And Paul embodies all of that. And if we watch his life, we begin to see just how much he went through. And through these last, if you've been keeping up with us as we've gone through it, you've been able to see just how much that man had to go through. And literally everywhere he went, his life was on the line. And we don't even know what that's like. There are people in our world that do know what that's like. There's people that have died for Christianity just because of their Christian faith. There are people that are in jeopardy right now in other places in the world that if somebody found out they believed in Jesus Christ, they would die before the sun goes down today. And we don't know how blessed we are to not have to be in that position. But Paul had to do this everywhere, and it wasn't because he was really doing anything that was a criminal act. It's just that he was uprooting something that was there the whole time, but the people refused to accept. Those Jewish leaders were so set on following the law that when Paul came in and said, no, Jesus Christ is the king that you've all been waiting for, the prophecies that were told to us by those before us, they're here now, and he's that person, and it blew their minds. And then the fact that he would consider even telling that message to someone besides a Jew, it just sent him over the top even more. So we've watched as he's gone town by town, village by village, church by church, and having to almost reteach what God is to these people. They followed the law to the T. They liked that part. But having to show them who Jesus Christ really was and that they could be saved by just having faith in him and didn't have to follow all those laws all the time, and it wasn't going to get him anywhere. So anyway, last week we were sort of getting toward the end of this, what we know as the third missionary journey. And if you remember, and I appreciate the writers doing such a good job of those of y'all that have taught through this 6 months of leaving all these gaps in for us to have to go back and fill in, because it's a job to try to include everything that was happening in between lessons. In this book especially, because there is so much action. But just for reference, how did we get to where we are? Paul is in Jerusalem, and he's being arrested. And if you don't have to turn back, I'm just going to catch up just a few little details, because in chapter 23, he's before the Sanhedrin. He's brought before the Sanhedrin. Now he's got to make defense for himself. In other words, it's, why should we not kill you now? And so he has to make defense in front of these people. And in chapter 23, there's a spot that we didn't really cover as we were going through in a lot of detail. But it's at chapter 23 and verse 11. There's a night where Paul is alone, and it says, the Lord stood by him and said, have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome. And that became the last mission that Paul would receive. You have taken this word everywhere else, but the place that you need to take it to finish the job is Rome. So he was on a mission from there to get to Rome, whatever it took, because that was what Jesus had told him he needed to do. Now, if you jump through those next for a couple of chapters that we did actually cover, he winds up defending himself in front of a lot of other people too. They were all, of course, he was in front of the Sanhedrin, and then when they get ready to, the Jews get ready to go mob and kill him, he's actually rescued by the Roman guard, because the Romans, if you remember from one of our studies, the soldiers had one duty: don't let riots break out. It was bad news. So to keep that from happening, and they didn't know what Paul was being attacked for, the Roman guards actually came in and arrested him to save his life and to prevent these huge riots. So he's put in prison. And so he goes before this series of people. One was Felix, who was the governor there. Then that guy just kind of kicks the can down the road, so to speak, keeps him in prison. And the next one is Festus. And you can read about that over in chapter 24. After 2 years had passed, Paul's sitting in prison this whole time, 2 years. And he's waiting to have his shot to go make his defense again. And Festus comes along. He does it again. And so, in fact, while they're fixing to transport him, and you watch God's hand on him the whole time. They're fixing to transport him in chapter 25, and there was an ambush that was planned by the Jewish leaders while he was on the transport to kill him. But Festus doesn't let him go. He keeps him in place. And so now he goes further, and there's another King Agrippa that we read about in one of our last lessons, and he goes before him, and that one kicks the can down the road, and we've got Bernice, and they come in, and they're listening to everything. And so person by person, Paul is stating his claim, making his case. And in one of those speeches to one of them, he says, I appeal to Caesar. Now, that was like the Supreme Court of their time. If you say, I want to appeal to Caesar, that's as far as it would go. And these other ones would just say, well, we'll just pass it off to the next guy. But if you appeal to Caesar, now you're going to get your say. But it was kind of like a last resort, big risk kind of thing. Because if it didn't go well, off with your head. But there was no more people to see. You know, we've got the Supreme Court in our country, and sometimes I know myself, I'll hear something going on in the news, I'll say, why don't they just take that Supreme Court and finish this thing instead of passing it back and forth between all these different district courts and regional courts? Just let the Supreme Court handle it and get it over with. That was sort of what Paul was after. I want to get to Caesar because I want to tell him my defense. But the real reason was that Jesus wanted him to go to Rome. You've told these people, the side story to all this is, while he's bouncing through all these people with authority and power in these big positions, they're all having to hear the gospel message, whether they wanted to or not. Because while he's making his defense, he's also witnessing to them. And people are hearing about it. And more people are being saved. A lot are rejecting it. But there's a whole lot that are accepting it too. So as we get over to chapter 27, Agrippa, into 26, this is kind of where we finished up last week. The last verse in chapter 26, which is 32. Agrippa says to Festus, this man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar. So by the time we get to King Agrippa, he says, I don't see any reason to keep this man as a criminal. He's not committing a crime. All he's doing is stating a belief in the righteousness of Jesus Christ, but he's not doing anything to someone else or harming anybody. There's no victim here. And so it says, but he's appealed to Caesar, and so we don't have a choice. And Festus before that says, hey, you appeal to Caesar you will go. So that's what you've asked for. So we begin chapter 27, picking up right there our story. Ton of detail in this chapter. We'll try our best to get through it in 30 minutes. But they get on a boat to sail, and we're heading for Italy. So I'm going to actually read some of this, even though it's not in your study book. Starting with verse 1. When it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius. So this centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. Now, when it says we, who does that include? Anybody got a clue? We've been working on this a while. Who's the we?
That includes, I think, Luke.
Luke, that's right. Luke is in this. Luke's our writer of Acts. So Luke is traveling with Paul. Now he's going to go with him all the way to Rome. He's sticking with him. Thank goodness for Luke writing all this down. When we had boarded a ship of that name I can't say, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. There's another person who has joined the group. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly, And that I underline because this tells us that God's hand is on this mission. For the Roman guard to see something in Paul, he's been protected by these governors all along. No one's killed him yet. Jesus had told him, you're going to go to Rome. And this Julius is a key, he's like a key picture in this thing. He treats Paul kindly, which means he sees something in Paul, he hears something in Paul, he knows something about Paul that he can trust. Why wouldn't he? Paul has traveled 10,000 miles. He knows a little something about traveling. He knows weather, he knows seasons, he knows places, he knows the seas, he's been on boats. It should listen to him. Okay, so Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends and receive their care. And when we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And after sailing through the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. All right, here's where the story starts to change. Sailing slowly for many days with difficulty, we arrived off Cnidus. Maybe that's right. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmon. With still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. By now much time had passed, we're not told how much, and the voyage was already dangerous, since the Day of Atonement was already over. Okay, the next section of verses is Paul's message to the people that they will not listen to. Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. It's not written there, but I believe that Paul was told by the Lord, you need to warn these men of what's about to happen. The one thing we do know about Paul from everything we read is Paul prayed all the time. He had a close conversation with the Lord at all times. And he has given them a warning. This is not a good idea to start sailing. And he's giving them a warning of what's going to happen. We could lose the ship. We could lose the cargo. We could even die. I don't think we need to do this. We're headed toward disaster. But notice what happens. But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. And the line that stuck out to me was, they listened to the majority. The majority decided to do so-and-so, to go ahead and set sail, and Paul was the exception. And that's kind of a good lesson for us at all times. There's going to be a lot of times when we're not the majority. In the United States, a Christian is really not the majority anymore. There's so many people that put down Christians and put us in the corner, and we've learned that's where we are, but that doesn't shut us up. We still need to stand bold and say what we believe and stand for it and live it and be an example. And Paul here doesn't back down. He says this is a bad idea, but they listened to the majority and decided to go anyway. All right. We have around here lots of different weather, right? We have snow, we have wind and hail. The one thing that we do have both of is tornadoes and hurricanes. I went to school at Campbell with a girl that was from Kansas. And I remember one of those years I was there, there was a hurricane that was coming. And, of course, it went through and everything. It really wasn't that bad, like a 1 or 2, and it kind of glanced us, and we got the rain and the wind off it. But it was like 2 days of it, you know. And she said, y'all are crazy to live out here with, with this, all this. And I said, well, what do you mean? She says, we got tornadoes where I'm from. She said, I've never seen a hurricane before. And I said, well, I don't know, but now a hurricane, it comes in and makes a mess, but most of the time, inland, it's not too bad. We just get, leaves knocked down and limbs knocked down. You got to clean up some mess. You might have a lot of rain. She goes, I'll take the tornado. I said, I'm sorry. She goes, they're gone, they're in, they're gone, they're out. In 30 seconds, it's over. And I said, yeah, it's fine till it hits your house, you know. But anyway, the point of it is the tornado is quick and hurricanes can last. Do y'all remember the one that just sat there for 3 or 4 days? All right, let's read a little. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called the nor'easter rushed down the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So ship has no control. The wind is dictating where they go. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff, and after hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days neither sun nor stars appeared. They're in a big storm, many days. We've already heard third day, now he says many days, and the severe storm kept raging. They are caught in this storm and they can't get out on this ship. We still don't have our details yet, but as we go further, imagine where they are. Now, I don't hate boats, but I don't want to be in the middle of the ocean in the middle of a hurricane, and that's where they are. This boat, and now remember, it's not a Carnival cruise ship. They, you know,
They didn't have compasses.
zero. That's right.
And
They're
so
just
they
going.
had to navigate by the stars.
Right.
And when you consider that you might have overcast skies, you have no stars to navigate by.
Mm-hmm.
And then you throw in the mix a little bit of inclement weather.
Bad news.
Bad.
Bad news.
You could wind up anywhere.
That's right. Okay, so severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. They are fearful that they are going to lose their lives. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up and said, and so we're starting to see a picture here now of who's going to be the one to calm all these people down. It's a chaotic time. When I got to this place, after reading it about 2 or 3 times through, I started thinking about people's lives and how they hit a spot in their life that is, it winds up being the one that they hit first that is horrible. And it may last a week, but it may last a year. It may last 5 years. Maybe it's a sickness. Maybe it's a loss. Maybe whatever it is. And they hit a spot in their life and they are being thrown around with nothing to guide them. Hopelessness. What are we going to do? We may die. And for that person, if they don't have a relationship with God, it's a horrible time to go through. And I don't know how people make it through it when they're in that place. But we're going to see here the rest of our lesson is on trusting God in those times. Trusting in knowing that when Jesus says he's going to carry us the whole way, he will do it. He had told Paul, you're going to get to Rome. So Paul already knows this is going to work out somehow. He's got enough faith. He's been told personally, you're going to Rome to talk to Caesar. So let's read on. So back at 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice, not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. I told you so. That's what he's saying. See, y'all didn't listen to me. I've been going around for 10 or 20 years, and you hadn't listened to what I said. I said, don't do this. It was a bad idea. But you did. And he says in 22, now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only the ship. For last night an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. He's promised again. You are going to go to Rome. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. but we have to run aground on some island. In other words, we got to get out of this ocean. We got to go crash the ship. We got to get to land. Now, that's the way I'd be. Get me to the land. I'm had enough of this. Now, what you don't know so far is, and we're about to read it, is how long they've been there. A day is plenty long for me. He says many days is plenty long. They're fighting. You remember this ship there? You've seen sailboats, these big ones. They got rigging things, ropes everywhere. It takes 25 guys to do one thing. Sails going up, coming down, getting torn apart, constantly fishing. There's no break if you're in a storm. So after a few hours, I'd be done. I mean, just give up. Verse 27, when the 14th night came, 2 weeks in a storm. 2 weeks is a long time. It's a very long time if you're in this situation. I mean, one day of pain and struggle is horrible. 2 weeks. Just imagine it for a second. How horrible that is. Day, night, 24 hours. 2 weeks of this. Constantly. And how they kept going, I do not know, other than they just wanted to survive. And now Paul has stood up and says, if you just listen to me, we're going to get here. We're going to get through this. When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. And when they had sailed a little farther and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. Okay, we're getting closer to something that's shallow. This is good news. Then, fearing we might run aground the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. So we got some that they're going to jump and run. We're getting to shallow water. Let's leave them. Let's get on this boat and go. Let's bail on the rest of them. Paul says to the centurion Julius and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. So he tells the Roman centurion, everybody's got to stay on this boat or we're not going to make it. That's what Paul was told. That's the instructions he gave them. And now he's got to stop people that want to abandon the ship. Unless these men stay, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it go away. Okay, so don't you know those guys were happy? They cut the ropes, let that one go. Now we got one boat and everybody is on it. I started thinking about Noah's Ark right here. Because what if Noah's sons is like, forget it, let's jump out of this boat, we'll take some of this, we'll take something over here and make in this abandoned ship. No, unless they stayed in Noah's Ark, unless they stayed in that ark, they were not going to survive that. And it's the lesson for us is unless we stay with Jesus and have him in our focus at all times, lean on him, he's got to be the one that we lean to in those times when we're in a storm. We're going to get out and struggle and drown. And think about Peter when he gets out of the boat. He says, I want to walk on the water. Jesus says, come on. He steps out and takes a couple of steps. He was fine as long as he was looking at Jesus. But the minute he stopped and goes, wait a minute, I'm walking on water. I'm not supposed to be doing this. Down he went. So the lesson there is stay in the boat. I would have anyway. So Paul says to the sinners, unless they stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. They cut the ropes, let that one go. Verse 33, when it was about daylight, Paul urged them to all take food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food. They haven't eaten. They haven't even had time to stop and eat. Imagine how weak they are and everything. So he says, haven't eaten nothing, so I urge you to take some food, for this is your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head. And after he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And that ought to just give us such a big picture and admiration for Paul that in the middle of all this, he still knows who his God is. He still knows to be thankful for God being with him. He's been through it all. These guys may not have been through what he's been through, but he's been through everything. And he's setting the best example for these people to just have faith in this boat. Have faith that God has promised he's going to take care of us. And to show that he honors God He gives thanks for the food that they haven't eaten for 2 weeks, so they haven't had time. In the presence of all of them, it says, after he broke it, he began to eat, and they were all encouraged and took food themselves. Look at this. In all, there were 276 people. 276 of us on the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Storm still rolling. They stop and eat. Paul says a prayer, thanking God for what they've got. They eat until they're full. They say, this is, okay, y'all remember the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks? That movie, it's a good movie, and it'll drive you nuts at the same time because you're thinking, how long is he going to stay there? But in that movie, he has to make a decision. Do I die on this island by myself, or do I risk it all and go for it? And he makes that pitiful something of a sailboat out of things that he's got, and he goes for it. And he has to weigh his options. And his option was try. Have faith in something, or just sit here and give up. And this is kind of where all these men are. They've either got to give up or they've got to trust in something. And the something they've been offered to trust is Paul's message about Jesus. My God says we're going to be fine if you stay on the boat with me. But if you jump out, you're never going to make it. So the plan was everybody eat, get some strength, because we're fixing to go for that beach. We're fixing to head for it. And the way we're going to get there, we got to get some speed. They work up the plan. They do all the planning. We're going to throw off the cargo, lighten the boat so we can get all the speed we can, and maybe we can make it straight to the beach. All right, 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they sighted a bay with a beach, and I bet it looked good. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could, and after cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran aground. Bad news. How many times do we say, well, all right, Lord, I see the plan, and that looks like the way to get to the end, and let's go for it. And he says, very good. And then when we head for what we think God's got for us, and old Satan says, not so fast. And he throws something in the way. And this sandbar happened to be right in the way of this ship. So it says they ran aground, they struck a sandbar, and they ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, and while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. So the front of the boat just nails the sandbar and it sticks. And all these waves are hitting this boat, and it starts breaking apart. And there they are. They can see the beach. They're close to the shore, and they're about to be safe. But they've got all this piling on them at the same time. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. Why this verse? Can anybody remember? Why would the soldiers have a plan to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape? Yep, because if these prisoners get away from them, their lives were now in jeopardy of being killed as well for losing a prisoner.
They were planning on killing them so they wouldn't.
Yep, that's what it says. Their plan was to kill them, but the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. And in this way, everyone safely reached the shore. And look at the obedience that had to be by these few people listening along the way, the faith of Paul that he had, trusting in the plan that God had for him here. This centurion sticks out to me because he didn't have to do some of the things he did. He could have just treated Paul like an old common criminal. But it was something about Paul that moved him, apparently. These prisoners were about to be killed by the soldiers, and he says, no, don't bother them. And I think at that point, he's like, look, if it weren't for this guy, Paul, we would be out here floating in the ocean still. But his God has seen us. We've made it to the beach. We're almost there. But,
Okay.
yes, sir. Go ahead.
There's two reasons. I mean, yes, he had seen Paul, he knew Paul, what he was doing, but also you gotta remember, Paul, as a Roman citizen, was protected by law until he had been convicted.
He saw
And
Caesar.
up to now,
Yep.
he has not been convicted of anything.
Right.
And if they mistreat him in any way, and Caesar says, you're not guilty, then he can turn around and everybody who did something bad to him under Roman law,
Yep.
it can be done back to them.
That's right. Yep. So because he's the Roman citizen, he was able to appeal to Caesar to begin with.
Exactly.
And so this Julius has taken care of him the whole way through. So now everyone has reached shore safely. And then we won't read the rest of Acts as we wrap up. But the message that I get out of this is that in all these circumstances that Paul's been through on this little story of the shipwreck, he's had to reach the pinnacle of trust and faith. When he is in those prisons all through these years that we've led up to today's story, imagine all the times that he was by himself and didn't have anyone to talk to, in a dungeon, cold, wet prison, whatever, many times shackled to the wall or tied to a Roman soldier. But we've come a long way from the day when Paul was Saul and he was persecuting Christians, and then winds up being the one that God chose, that Jesus would use and talk to reach the Gentile world. I mean, if Paul hadn't said what he said, how much more would have had to happen for the Gentiles to be given the opportunity? How much more would have happened for Peter and the other disciples to accept it? You remember Paul said, I had to tell Peter straight to his face, this message is for Gentiles too. But even though Paul was given that mission and openly accepted it and was honorable to Jesus and serving the Lord in his missionary journeys, he still knew that along with that was come all of this persecution, all of this struggle, all of these times when he was going to be tested, and he was going to have to grow in his faith more and more and more each time. If you think back to when we were studying Abraham, and you remember the times that Abraham would have to progress in his faith, just one thing would happen and he would have to be stronger in his faith, and then something else would happen and he could draw back from that event to be stronger in his faith. It was all a story of his growth in his faith. And Paul's life is very similar. Abraham didn't sit in prisons, but Paul had to go through. It's almost like Paul did the rest of what Jesus would have done had he stayed here instead of being crucified. Because if Jesus would have not been crucified and had to live out carrying the good news around that I'm here to save the world, he'd have been thrown in those prisons over and over and over. And Paul kind of took that spot in a way while being a missionary. But Paul sets the example for all of us, for all those disciples that he taught, all those churches that he taught and to teach. He sets the example for all of them by being the ultimate guinea pig, I guess you'd say, for what you may face as you go through things in life. And the writer's got a little sentence under the title, Believers Can Find Joy Through Trusting God in All Circumstances. Well, it's hard to find the joy when you're in something that's a struggle. That's the hardest part, is finding some joy in it. But the joy comes off of it, knowing that you're doing what God wants you to do, that you're living in Him, that you're trusting in Him, and that when it's all over, you look back and go, how about that? He stuck with me the whole way, and I made it. And so all those things that we go through that are those horrible events, like I mentioned earlier, and everybody's got them. We could go one by one, and everybody's got their story of a time in your life whether it was a day, a week, or a year or more, that it was a horrible time. It was just tough. And you can point back to the trusting in Jesus and trusting in God to get you through it and knowing that he will. And once you're on the backside of it, and you can look back and go, how about that? Look at what he did for me. I made it. And this is what Paul has taught all these 276 on board. They've all seen it now. Man, that God of Paul's, he took care of us. He got us all. We were in a storm for what a story they got to tell now. How many of those guys get saved out of this? We're not told. But look at what they've all learned from Paul's example. And we could go on and on and on about what Paul's done here. Now, finishing up Acts, as we wrap up our study, Paul actually goes to Rome, gets his shot. He goes in and he gives his first interview, with like the Roman people and everything. But anyway, he winds up in a prison for years. Again, why? He's got to be saying, I have done all this traveling. You sent me to Rome, Lord, to put me in a prison for all these years? I'm just going to sit here in this jail? But there was another purpose, because while he was sitting in those jail cells, he wrote letters to Colossae and Philemon and Thessalonica. He's writing letters to those churches. And had he not sat in those prison walls, we wouldn't have about that much of our Bible. Because that was what God was using. So like your last mission is go to Rome, tell Caesar. That's as high as you could go at the time. Get my word to the highest ranking person that you can find. Now, sit there and finish speaking. I'm fixing to tell you the rest of my word. Get it on paper. Write these letters. And Paul may or may not have known it was going to turn into Scripture for us to read 2,000 years later, but he did know that he had to finish his job. He didn't quit. I'm amazed how Paul just goes and goes and goes and never gives up. And Luke too, he kind of gets in the shadow here, but Luke stuck with him this whole time. All these verses we read, we. Luke's right there with him. And just looking at how much he's done for us as Christians, we should be so thankful to his example and knowing that we can follow what he's done. And I have, you got more we could talk about. Other questions, comments you all think about?
Mm-hmm. You read that back in verse 23. So he stopped at nothing to let his servant succeed. And then God's behind him. He's going to make it happen. Mm-hmm. I think the same's true for us too.
Yes, sir.
We're sold out to God.
Mm-hmm. I always, when I'm thinking about his resolve, his persistence to keep going, I keep thinking about when he talks about running the race, finishing the course and finishing strong. And I heard one pastor this week said, it's not as much how you start the race, but it really matters how you finish your race. And, you start a race. I didn't run cross country or anything. Some of you may have. I didn't like the idea of running that much. I ran enough in sports I did play. I didn't care to run more and more and more. But the people that do run cross country and they run marathons, they'll tell you there's times in the middle of the race where there's struggles. That part's not easy. I watched that Tour de France and watched the days where they it's all uphill. That's got to be an awful day to look forward to. But they don't quit. And then once they turn the last corner and see the finish line, they say, all right, they realize all those struggles were worth it because they can cross the finish line. And so for us, it's the same thing. It's just continuing to trust all the time, no matter what we're in, what the conditions are, who we're with, if we're the minority or if we're the only one left that believes in God, just not stopping and continuing to trust and have faith in him all the way to the end. So, but this finishes up our study on Acts. It's been a good study. We didn't cover everything. We tried our best to get through all these chapters. Like I said, there's so much there that you just can't get to all of it in 26 lessons. But go back and read it as you can and study more. There's a guy on YouTube called Jim Mackey. If you get time to watch him, he does about a 15-minute breakdown of the book of Acts. And it's black and white. You can watch it as he draws stuff and he's talking about it at the same time. But it's a good place to go. Just get a 15-minute explanation, and it's very thorough. So, anybody got any more questions or comments? All right, next week we will begin Exodus. We did Genesis, and now we're going to go back where we finished up there and go some more. So we'll be learning about going back to old Joseph and his family, and when the Israelites were in Egypt and getting ready to leave there after Pharaoh's treated them like dirt for 500 years. So. All right, anybody else? Let's have prayers to close. Mitch, you pray for us. Yep.
Dear Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the many blessings, dear Lord. No matter what we're in, we all need to be thankful for all the things that you do for each and every one of us. Dear Lord, our lesson this morning is about trust. We must put all our trust in you, dear Lord, no matter what's going on around us, in our lives, in our community, or with our country, dear Lord. We know that you're still on the throne, that you'll be there, dear Lord. Always embrace the wisdom of godly people that are around you, dear Lord, and just reach across the aisle to your brothers and sisters, dear Lord. Thank you for the unity of this church. The unity has been shown this weekend, dear Lord. We just want to praise you for that. Dear Lord, as we go to our next part of our Sunday morning service, dear Lord, help our pastor to have the words and the wisdom, dear, and the clarity, dear Lord, and give him that as he brings a message to us. And we'll be thankful, and please be with those people who can't be here, and we'll praise you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.